Before we get started on our next plenary, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of things that we've produced at ECS around the teacher pipeline and why this issue is so personally important to me. The slide that's up there right now talks about 6 important papers that we've created that are all available on our website and through the app that you have for this conference. But we did a major paper that was really around, what are the teacher shortages? What do we know? What are the facts? What are some of the myths? And then we really did an individual paper on 5 major policies that we're seeing in the states around alternative certification, financial incentives, induction and mentorship, evaluation and feedback, teacher leadership. And in all those papers, there's state examples where some states are making a difference and working on this issue, and I'd urge you to look at them. But for me, while the staff was doing amazing research and putting these papers together, the issue was a little bit more personal, because I understand the value of what teachers can have in the outcomes we desire for the future workforce. But I also understand that there's a different kind of teacher that's teaching these days. I had a teacher who made a tremendous impact on my life. But I want to give you some numbers, as I've talked about. I'm a number person. I want to give you some numbers about this teacher. 43 years in the high school classroom. 18 different principals. 13 different schools. 9 different school districts. 1 state, and a starting salary of $7,000. That teacher is Mr. Bob Anderson, my dad. And my dad had an impact on so many thousands of students as a high school English teacher and as a gifted teacher. But there's not a lot of teachers like my dad out there who will have 43 years of service in the school district. And that's why we're having some of the pipeline questions that we're having right now. My mother taught for 30 years before she retired. But we're not having that same kind of pipeline where teachers are able to stay that long and be that invested in it. And I think that's why it's a real policy issue that we need to be asking, because I see it with my own children in their high school where turnover rates are sometimes at 20%. And so the next discussion that we're going to have is actually from Linda Darling-Hammond, national expert, and we are ecstatic to have her be able to go through some major findings that she's been working at on the Learning Policy Institute. Linda's not able to be with us today because of travel problems, but she is going to be on the phone, and we have some slides for 10 minutes with her, and then we're going to have a panel discussion with 3 additional experts to talk through this important issue. So without further ado, I'm honored to introduce you, at least through audio, Linda Darling-Hammond.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I'm glad to join you, and sorry not to be there in person. But delighted you're taking on this very important topic, which is such a recurring one in American education. I myself entered teaching in 1973 during a previous era of shortage, and while there were many policies then seeking to address the problems, many of them have disappeared, and we're confronting once again the need to find teachers in areas where not enough of them are available. So I'm going to ask Amy to work with me in clicking through these slides and on to the second one. What we saw this last fall, and many of you in your state saw this, were a set of headlines coming up from all over the country about shortages that were occurring in math, science, special education, bilingual education, English as a second language. And in these occurrences, quite often there was a lot of surprise because we've had teacher layoffs for the last several years as a function of the recession. But as soon as a little bit of money began coming back into the system, what we found, going on to the next slide, was that we've had a very big drop in the number of people preparing to teach in this country. You can see that over that period from about 2009 until about 2014, the most recent data we have available, there was a 30% drop in the number of people preparing to teach. And that really has been a part of what has caused this latest round of teacher shortages around the country. Going on to the next slide, what is happening is that while also the demand for teachers was kept down during the time of budget cuts and layoffs, that's changing. People are beginning to return to the class sizes and programs they had before. States, there's a projected increase in demand that will surpass our supply and is doing that right now. And the prognosis, unless we change what we're doing, is pretty scary for the years ahead. One of the things that's really critical here is the turnover rate that we keep in the United States. Moving on to the next slide, the critical issue for many of us who have a long memory is that we're having a sort of a deja vu all over again of the challenges we had a decade or more ago. On to the next slide, you can see this reminder from California about how big a disparity in access to qualified teachers occurred back in 2000 there. This occurred across the country and is happening again now, where students in high minority schools, in low-income schools, in schools that are underperforming, were many times more likely to have teachers without the training in their content area or in the pedagogies of teaching than children in other schools. And as states are putting together their educational equity plans, we see this emerging again, where those ratios of assignments to teachers who also often turn over very, very rapidly are very disproportionate for schools of different kinds, and of course are a major problem in closing the achievement gap. So on to the next slide. What do we know? Having been through this before, what do we know about what matters in recruiting and retaining teachers? How can we solve this problem once and for all? It is a problem that is relatively unique to the United States. It's not a problem in Finland, Singapore, Canada, and many other places which I've recently studied for their teacher policies. Obviously, the attractiveness of the profession makes a difference. Compensation matters. In those countries that don't have shortages, typically teachers earn the same amount as other college graduates. In the United States, depending on the state, teachers may earn anywhere from 60 to 80, perhaps 90% of what other college graduates earn in the states that are most attentive to teacher salaries. But it is very variable across the country, and both entry and exit are tied to compensation levels. We've had a lot of teacher bashing in the last decade, and that has really undermined the attractiveness of the profession. Young people who saw the layoffs happening, of course, if they were intelligent, said, gee, this doesn't look like a profession to go into. Preparation matters. Those who get fully prepared to teach are much more likely to stay in teaching. Those who come in without student teaching and without having a full preparation are 3 times more likely to leave in the first few years than those who have been fully prepared, because it's a very difficult job and hard to maintain if you don't have the tools to do it well. Mentoring makes a huge difference. Those who have strong mentoring, which means not only a mentor in your content area to coach you in the classroom and help you with your planning, your curriculum planning, but also collaboration time with other teachers, often a reduced teaching load. Those who have that mentoring are much more likely to stay in the first few years of teaching and to get competent and effective much more quickly than those who miss that kind of mentoring. And while most of our states have programs, again, the funding for those mentors has been cut substantially during the recession. And then teaching conditions matter, especially the extent to which teachers feel that they can be efficacious and that they have help from their administrators to do the work that they are trying to do. So one of the things we can do is attend to these areas if we want to address the shortages. It's not just a matter, of course, of compensation. As one National Board Certified teacher put it, moving now to the next slide on attracting great teachers to high-need schools, about moving to a low-performing school, he said, I would move to a low-performing school, but I would want to see social services for parents and children, accomplished leadership, adequate resources and facilities, flexibility, freedom, and time. One of the single greatest factors in school success is principal leadership. Effective administrators, are magnets for accomplished teachers. Finally, as an accomplished teacher, my greatest fear is being assigned to a hard-to-staff school and not being given the time and flexibility to make the changes I believe are necessary to bring about student achievement. So, in fact, a big part of solving teacher shortages is to get principals in place who understand, who are well prepared to create the kinds of settings in which teachers can do effective work. So how might we proceed? On to the next slide. One important issue for addressing the current shortages is actually to keep the teachers we have. We pay a lot of attention in these times of shortage to recruiting people. Quite often the strategy has been to reduce the amount of training that people get, pull them into classrooms faster. Unfortunately, this leads to higher attrition and higher turnover for those teachers, and we get a leaky bucket phenomenon. In fact, our attrition rates for teachers in the United States are about twice as high as they are in places like Canada, Singapore, Finland. We're at about 8% annual attrition. Those countries are at 3 to 4%. If we were just to stop losing teachers at that rate, we would not have shortages. And so we need to think about this as part of the solution. The replacement costs for a teacher who leaves are somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 per teacher. If we were to treat people with the mentoring and support when they come in, that would be a better use of those dollars. The next slide shows one of the strategies that is emerging around the country as a way to treat this problem, especially in high-need districts, often urban and rural districts, often those that serve a high concentration of children in poverty and students of color, new immigrant students. And this is teacher residencies that bring people in for a year of apprenticeship under the wing of an effective teacher while they are supported to get their preparation and credential and a master's degree. What you can see in San Francisco is that people who come in through this residency route, which they have just doubled in size because of its success, are staying at rates of 80% over 5 years in the city. And in fact, 97% of those teachers stay in the profession somewhere, compared to their other new hires who come in other strategies or pathways where only 38% stay. And so what happens is that they're then paying the cost of that continual leaky bucket rather than actually meeting their needs in math, in science, and special education in those high-need fields. Next slide. The residency approach, which now exists in about 50 places across the country, includes a partnership between the district and universities, a year-long apprenticeship with an expert teacher who can really demonstrate what a wonderful urban teacher or rural teacher in that community knows how to do with those specific kids and the district's specific ways of working. The coursework is integrated with that clinical placement, so it is coherent and makes sense. There's opportunities to observe other experts. There's a stipend, a housing grant, health care, a guaranteed job, and tuition remission. For that, the resident gives a 3-year commitment to stay in the district and teach in a high-need school. They get 2 years of coaching and mentoring after they start teaching to be sure that they are supported well enough by carefully trained mentors. It is kind of what we know how to do, but it's being brought together in a number of places. So to close up, I'm on the last slide. What we ought to be thinking about doing in this era of shortages is not just reacting reflexively to getting warm bodies into classrooms and trying to get them to pass what we called the mirror test when I came into teaching, which is, you blow on the mirror, if it fogs up, you're hired. But in fact, to proactively put in place the pathways that we need to solve the problem once and for all. Part of this is going to be building the pathways with preparation that's adequate and mentoring that gets people in and makes them effective and keeps them in. Residencies and other innovative preparation pathways can be part of the solution. Grow Your Own pathways are very successful in some parts of the country. Getting paraprofessionals in special education and bilingual ESL education through credentialing programs is another way to get people from the community prepared to teach, ensuring that we rebuild the mentoring for them. Many districts are looking at salaries, housing subsidies, building dormitories, providing mortgage guarantees, child care, retiree options. These turn out to be very important to a lot of teachers in deciding where to settle and whether to stay. And then, of course, there's the key issue of addressing the conditions of teaching, which especially involve time with colleagues and supportive principals that make it possible for teachers to be effective in their work, which is the greatest success and joy and compensation for most teachers doing the job they want to do on behalf of children. Thank you, and I will pass this on to the other panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. I'm now excited to introduce the next three panelists who are going to be joining us on the stage for an in-depth conversation. It's my honor to welcome Emerson Elliott with the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation to the stage, to invite Kent McGuire, the President and CEO of the Southern Education Foundation, and to invite Johanna Hayes, the 2016 National Teacher of the Year, to join me on the stage. As they're getting settled, I want to run through a couple of quick slides and some things that we have in the papers that I talked about. The first of those slides, I think, is looking at, is this a cyclical issue or is it not? And some of the numbers that we've highlighted are percent of schools with at least one teaching vacancy in 99 versus 2011. It looks like it was worse in 99 than it is in 2011. We're seeing more of that now, but we want to make sure we understand that there are some cyclical parts to this. And I think the deja vu all over again that Linda talked about is one of those things that we need to keep in mind. The second is the difficulty in many of your schools in finding teachers for some specific teaching areas, special education, some sciences, foreign languages, arts, and at least one subject area with difficult to staff teaching positions. In 2000, there were 36% of the schools that had that problem. In 2011, 2012, it was 15%. This is still a big problem, but some of these issues are deja vu all over again, and it's one of the things that we want to talk about on the panel. I'd like to start off by throwing the microphone to Emerson to kind of talk about what they're seeing and what they're seeing through some of the accreditation issues and what are some of the issues that are outlined across the country.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I think many of the things that Linda is talking about are things that center a great deal around starting preparation in colleges of education. I just want to say a couple of words at the outset about CAPE, the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, as an organization, because frequently people have no idea what an accreditor is or what it does, and how much that function intersects with state responsibilities. Accreditation is a function that's a non-governmental function. It is a process that works on quality assurance through the process of writing standards that the profession agrees to generally. And then there is a peer review of a self-study prepared by the institution that is seeking accreditation. The authority for this kind of function is invested in all states, and you do this in all fields, including medicine and law. But you have a special interest in this area in education because of your constitutional responsibility for the education function. And so our partnerships, and there is a slide here that shows where we are working very closely with states in direct partnerships in which we make arrangements for carrying out these accreditation reviews with state staff and with classroom teachers. So this is a very participatory, peer review process. Jeremy, I want to kind of try to pull this together by saying this whole process operates by having explicit standards. And sometimes those standards are challenging and a little bit difficult to figure out how institutions will meet. And our standards are based on the best the profession can tell us from research and from the practice of organizations in continuous improvement and encouraging quality assurance systems that we can assemble to state standards. And the standards involve especially content and pedagogical knowledge. They involve partnerships for clinical preparation, and they involve selection of individuals with higher academic achievement. That has been an extremely controversial one of our standards. What are the provisions of that standard? Why do we have that standard? Why is it there? It is very much oriented to P-12 student learning. We have that standard because that is one of the levers that colleges and universities could exercise to make a difference in P-12 student learning. Why is that? The research shows that there is a close association between academic achievement of teachers and P-12 student learning. And that relationship is especially important for students at risk. And the research is consistent, has been there for a long time, and it's found in international studies as well as local ones. Because that standard is controversial, we have been taking a closer look at it. And because we wanted to make sure that we heard from everybody, we had several focus group conversations about that standard earlier this year. And one of those was with representatives of your states. The message was mixed. The people who came from your states were very cognizant of teacher shortages that were being faced in the state. And they said, we don't want to do anything that will make that problem more difficult in our state. And our chief state school officer talks to us about that. And CAPE, are you making that problem more difficult by having this standard? On balance, however, the view was, we want you to hold for high quality, and this is an important high quality measure, and stick with it. And that's what we did.
Thanks. And I think, Emerson, some of the questions that are out there in the States is, what is the standard for high quality, and how is that affecting the shortage issues? And I think we've seen in some of the teacher prep programs on the slides we've shown where the number of students in college who are in teacher prep programs has gone down over the last 5 years. But as Linda showed in her slides, that's happened in other decades also at different times.
Right.
So Kent, I think from your perspective with the Southern Education Foundation, talk to us about what you've seen around the country on some of this, because this is a big issue that you've been involved in.
Thank you, Jeremy. You know, I'm a recovering dean. Let me say that first takes 3 years for every 1 year of service, so I'm still in recovery. And I was up in Philly when I did that and watched our enrollments change as the state, I think for all the right reasons, increased the GPA required to enter candidacy, for instance. And make that change right at a time when the changing demographics, you know, in the state, you know, really put pressure on all programs to increase the diversity of their, of their enrollments. This tension is even more vivid where I am now in the American South, where students of color and low-income students are clearly a majority of the students enrolled in public schools, and where the highest percentage of candidates of color are enrolled in preparation programs. My foundation has a long history of working with historically black colleges and universities who may not prepare lots of teachers in the aggregate, but prepare high percentages of teachers of color. And I guess it's standard number 3. I know that. I know that because we've actually convened the leadership of those schools a few times in the last year or so. And we've done some of that in talking with folks at Cape to try to figure out how those standards can be appropriately met. So I think there's a tension there that we ought to, through innovation, Shana, and other ways, kind of struggle with it. If we don't, you know, I heard Randy say this at a panel a couple of weeks ago, you know, we're really going to bump right up against the problem, I think, that Linda, you know, described, where a legitimate interest in quality rubs right up against a legitimate and an important need to increase considerably, substantially, the diversity of the workforce. One last thing I'll say right now, because Linda mentioned this, I got a file folder full of educator equity plans that I was sort of looking at as I thought about coming here. And it is also true that the schools, the poorest schools with the highest concentrations of high-need students, are, as you go from state to state, the schools with the least well-prepared teachers, the folks with the least amount of experience and support, and increasingly the least diverse. So it's a challenge that we really do need to confront.
So Johanna, your experience as the National Teacher of the Year for 2016, congratulations.
Thank you.
Talk a little bit about your experience and what you've seen in the profession, because I think there's a lot of issues out there for state leaders especially saying, where does principal leadership or teacher leadership come into play and has it made a difference? How does mentoring help in these capacities to try to make it so that while we have teachers who join the profession right out of a teacher prep program, can we keep them in those positions for 5 years or for 10 years, or perhaps as long as I mentioned with my father for 43 years?
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. And for me, as a classroom teacher, when I think about infusing the pipeline, I have to look at it as a classroom teacher. So my lens is very different than the policymaker and the recovering dean. Yes. So everything with me starts with my students. So first of all, early exposure. As a high school teacher, it pains me year after year when I ask my students, you know, what profession. And every year the number who even consider teaching as a profession diminishes. And I think that really, so I ask myself, what can I do about that? You know, how can I, you know, improve those numbers? And I think as teachers, first of all, we have to be very purposeful in our interactions with students. Every interaction. There's so much negative and inaccurate media perception surrounding this profession. So kids need to know going in that their teachers enjoy what they do, and it is something that is of value, that it is a noble profession. You know, when my students were interviewed for this Teacher of the Year process, they didn't really talk about content. They talked about the interactions that they had with me as their teachers. So I would encourage the education community, you know, watch what you say. You know, watch how you perceive this profession. The life of a Teacher of the Year is very different than a life of a classroom teacher. People are, I'm sitting here. You know, for the last decade, I've fought to be heard. And that's not what teachers experience. So that's not what students see. Another thing that I've done at my school, we've started student internships where they work alongside teachers and really see the positives of this profession. We've established vibrant yes clubs to give them opportunities, you know, to be engaged with teachers and see the other side, not just what they see from their seats, but, you know, the value that is in this profession. And I have had to learn not to wait for things to happen, but to network within my community, to find resources, you know, mentorships, partnerships, so that teachers feel supported in other ways. I think so often we just wait for legislation to be passed when we have to create those opportunities for ourselves. As far as educator preparation programs, I think one of the biggest things that I found, I've visited HBCUs to try to talk to teachers, and some of the issues with reciprocity from state to state, I really can't wrap myself around why the requirements for a teacher in Connecticut, we have very rigorous testing, Praxis 1, 2, there's a literacy test, are very different from the requirements for a teacher in New York. So you can't even travel from state to state as a teacher. You know, I'm the National Teacher of the Year, but if I decided I want to move to, I don't know, Wisconsin, Alabama, I can't teach in Alabama. You know, so there's something, I'm not really sure what that means or why that is, but you know, we're in a room with people from all over the country. I think that's a conversation that we need to have. And those programs really need to look at, I came out of college content ready. I could write a lesson, I could manage a class, I could transition, I had buzzwords, all this stuff. But lucky for me, I teach in the community where I was born, so I knew how to engage the community. I don't think preparation programs do enough to teach young and developing teachers. Teaching is not just about what happens in the classroom. And there's not enough emphasis put on putting teachers into communities, engaging them as partners, teaching them how to work with parents outside of the classroom. And then finally, I can't leave the stage without talking about recruiting minorities. I think that so much of our problem lies in the fact that I work in the fourth largest urban district in Connecticut. It is a majority minority district. We have about 76% minorities. I went through my whole career as a student with all female white teachers. You know, so if you're saying you have to see it to be it, I didn't know what that meant. You know, none of my teachers looked like me, understood my culture, were from my community. And when you have students who are minorities who have had so many negative experiences in the classroom, why would you want to go back and teach in that type of an environment or work or make that your life's work? So we really have to, you know, think about cultural competency and letting those students see that they have value as well and can add something to this profession.
What, I think we ought to just pause and soak in what she just said.
Thank you. We have a lot of state leaders in the audience with us, and one of the difficulties is some of the funding issues. I mean, for many legislators, governors, chief state school officers, I mean, your K-12 budget is almost 50% of what the entire state budget is. It's a big expense. And compensation comes into play. We get a lot of questions at the Education Commission of the states on how do we change compensation for our teachers, but teacher compensation makes up a very large percentage of that state appropriation. Alabama had a 4% increase for teachers. South Dakota had one of the largest increases in the history of their state for teachers. How, though, does compensation come into play, and is that one of the factors that can help to change some of the pipeline issues?
Definitely, teacher compensation comes into play. Jeremy, you mentioned that it's a large part of the school budget. One would wish that it was an even larger part of the school budget. That is, that a decision would be made by local school officials and state school officials to keep the investment at the level where it connects directly with the students as much as possible. One of the things that you can learn by looking at the numbers, interestingly enough, about private schools and public schools is that somehow private schools have been able to keep administrative costs much more contained than public schools. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. They don't have to run a bus service and other things, so those need to be part of the explanation. But it should be a conscious goal to keep administrative costs within reason so that more can be invested directly in schools. But I think if you're looking at working conditions, one of them is definitely pay. And I think that there, in Linda's recommendations, there are other ideas also about working conditions, collaboration, ability for professional rewards, being able to work with your colleagues, and those kinds of things that are a part of what are making people say they don't want to move into this profession. But Kent, before you pick up, there was a report from the state of New York put out 2 years ago that says actually if you look at the academic achievement of people coming in to prepare to be teachers in the state of New York, it actually has increased in the last 4 or 5 years compared with the period before that, which was a very interesting finding. I think a number of people didn't understand why that was happening. And the authors of that study said it was because of policy initiatives in the state of New York to encourage people to go into teaching and to try to reward that field. So it's not all that bleak.
Well, I think there are a number of things states can do. I mean, this is another area for innovation, arguably. But states shape markets. While I too think we ought to figure out how to put more money in the system, there are also things we can do in the system we have to create more efficient markets that also help us pursue some of the goals we have, both for the size and composition of the pipeline. There's no reason we couldn't negotiate reciprocity agreements. When you enter into agreements with states, you're using a common set of standards across the country, for instance. Right. And those could be linked, in some places they are, to the licensing and certification requirements across states so that there's less variation or rigidity in those markets. The common salary schedule is another area for real innovation. Right now, the money is predictably in the back end of the schedule. If you're going to improve the pipeline, we're going to need to move some of the money to the front end. And we're going to have to think about how a teacher progresses over the course of a career. We might need to acknowledge the reality that careers are changing anyway, and that people don't stay in any given occupation for 30 or 40 years. That's not the growing pattern. So it has huge implications for the structure and nature of the compensation system, in terms of getting the mix. I was on a school board for 8 years. I'm still recovering from that too. As a matter, now I think about it. But we had very interesting policy discussions about what's the nature of the workforce we wanted in our community. And then we got quickly to talking about, does our salary schedule actually work toward that mix or against it? So I think there's opportunity for innovation here that isn't rocket science. We could actually figure some of these things out.
I think that when we talk about compensation, that's a very simplistic target because, first of all, teachers are not doing this for the compensation. If I got paid dollar for dollar, hour for hour, I would have a very different life.
Or you'd be making $200.
I would have a very different life, absolutely. So, I mean, yes, we like to be valued, we want to be respected, we want to be paid what we believe that we're worth. However, I think that when we talk about working within the system, there are so many opportunities for engaging other stakeholders, to partner with us. It doesn't have to be all these isolated. We have 52 Teachers of the Year here as a result of Scholastic, who said, we think it's important that you're here, and we will support this. So there are lots of very different, I think that everyone is owning the problem, as opposed to collaborating our resources, working together, everyone taking responsibility for the part that belongs to them and fixing the problem in a very holistic way. This very isolated approach everybody has a piece of, we have to figure out all the components of this issue about compensation. No, how do we all work together? The program that I started at my school was as a result of me securing a $75,000 grant from my state, to get this program off the ground. My school district said, we don't have the money to do that. And I thought about if my students came to me with that same problem, my response would be figure it out. So I think my response today is figure it out.
Good. Good. We are going to open up to questions for the audience, so we'll have mic runners out there, and if you have a question, please raise your hand and they will come and find you. One of the questions I want to get back to is some of the reciprocity issues, because we've heard from that from a lot of states and from some of the chiefs. I mean, in many cases, I think the requirements for certification were put in place for what at the time was thought the right reasons. It was quality, it was specific different areas of expertise that they wanted. But without the reciprocity, I think some of those states are realizing it's hard to recruit from other states or to bring in teachers in some of those hard to fill positions like foreign language or special education or arts. So talk about some of the areas where you think that needs to be looked at differently, because reciprocity in many other professions is a pretty easy thing that's figured out. I mean, you can sell insurance in multiple different states. You can work in the medical field in multiple different states with licenses.
It's silly. It's just silly. My kids in Connecticut deserve the same high-quality education as kids in California, Alaska, Minnesota, Alabama, every state in the country. It's silly to say that the quality of the teacher should vary from state to state when I was just in Kentucky. Literally, I was standing in Kentucky and Indiana at the same time. But you can't be certified. The requirements in the two states are very different. So that is something that just seems silly.
You want to speak to this?
Just silly.
A little bit on two things. One is that there is an organization called NASDAQ that is into at least sharing information about what these requirements
Right.
are from state to state. But I think, Johanna, one of the issues is that you need to move to a higher political level to get agreement on the kinds of issues that you're talking about. But I want to mention a special concern of mine about this area, and that is the interstate sharing of information is really very important, but it is very difficult because you immediately run into privacy issues. So NASDAQ is working on a kind of pilot project so that they can at least share information about criminal records and things like that that are important when you're moving people from one state to another. But there are a lot of important things about the experiences that a teacher has had or the credentials that a teacher has that would be important for hiring and important for making a decision about whether the credentials that a teacher has are essentially the same as the ones that our state requires. And it's very difficult to get states to agree to share that kind of information because of privacy issues. I am convinced, and maybe I'm totally crazy about this, that there could be a technical fix that would make it possible for the data to be in a warehouse someplace that nobody actually has access to, but that could allow links to be made, and then you would get the result of it in a way that would protect privacy. But I think that is a big challenge, and I know the Data Quality Campaign is working on that piece of it.
Well, if you're a teacher and you've been teaching, I have friends who've been teaching 15, 20 years,
Right.
and they are saying, I'm not going to pay more money. I'm not going to be retested. I'm not going, so they leave the profession and do something in education,
Right.
but not specifically teaching
Right.
because the hoops they have to jump through to continue to be certified
Right.
are just so very different. I think that we, like you said, people move, people transition. We're a very different world. You can't expect, people are not expected to stay in one place their whole life anymore.
No.
So I think we have to, if you want different results, we have to do things a little bit differently.
If we can use electronic records in medicine and big exchanges, use personal data every day to make sure that folks' claims get paid everywhere in the country. So clearly, Emerson, it's possible. There's a technical fix. There's a technical
Good.
fix.
Do you have any questions from the audience for our panel? Got one up here. If we can get a
Utah
microphone
Senator
up
Howard
here.
Stevenson. I'm thinking of Dr. Hammond's comments on high-need schools and the previous ed talk on getting the shoes to fit the right kids in that equity issue. Many of our LEAs that have one side of the district that have high-need schools, and the other side of the district is higher income. And yet, through accounting sleight of hand, the district reports that the spending is greater in the Title I schools with the additional funding. But what they use is the average teacher salary of the entire district, and so the lower experienced teachers in the high-need schools you're actually spending less money in the high-need schools than you are in the other side of the district. This is an issue, I think, that exists in all of our states, and for the legislators in the room, can you tell us has there been research done on this? Because it seems to me that if we had the money actually spent in those high-need schools, we would have the staffing ratios better. We would have the kind of experienced teachers there in those schools rather than the sleight of hand accounting of averages of teacher salaries. I don't know if that's understood, but I think it's happening in all of our states, in those districts where you have half the district with high need and half the district with not high need.
I'm not sure the question was for anybody up here, but I do think it's happening. You know, say it differently. The intra-district variations in spending might be as great or greater than the variations in spendings between districts. We studied it in Philly when I was at Temple. We're sort of looking at it, you know, across the South as we peer into resource equity issues. You know, the other way to get at this, I mean, I think you're right. You know, as a practical matter, all that's going on is that the folks who make more money, you know, tend to be concentrated in certain kinds of schools, right? It's a working conditions issue, right? You know, some teachers, you know, enjoy working in places where it's easier to work. If we created incentives for our really competent teachers and committed ones to work in the schools with the greatest need, that would begin to solve the problem or make a big difference in it. You know, there were attempts at a point along the way in the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards to run an experiment of creating incentives to sort of concentrate highly qualified teachers in such schools. I know I was at MDRC in New York and we were prepared to evaluate that if it happened. I just read an article on a plane coming here studying the performance-based pay system in Denver, which has a long history. Right. And what the article reveals is that the incentives to which teachers responded, to an earlier point you made, had actually more to do with showing up in high-need schools and in being in settings with kind of group performance awards. So I think it is a reality, but it's also a dynamic that we could impact if we wanted to.
Emerson?
Jeremy, in an earlier life, I was in the U.S. Department of Education, NCES. I can assure you that this issue has been studied and studied and studied and studied. It is, as Kent says, true. It is also a hot political issue. It falls under the maintenance of effort that is a part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I believe that the current Secretary of Education has tried to write regulations that would change that phenomenon, and he was called on the carpet by Senator Alexander in the United States Senate for going beyond the regulations authority that he had under that act. So talk with your congressman or your senator about handling that issue. But it is a real issue, and it is a scandal, and it has been in place since 1964.
Okay. So if it's been studied and studied and studied, and we know it to be true, and it's what's best for kids,
Right.
why aren't we doing it?
And we let it go.
Why aren't we doing it? I
Yeah.
mean, we
Right.
have people from all over the country here. I feel like, I think from a classroom teacher, you look at things through a very different lens. You know, if something is not working, then you don't continue to do it. You step back, you reflect, you evaluate. I'm just saying, right? I'm just saying.
Yeah.
If we know that this is an issue, it is not working, and we're discussing the problem, I almost feel like we're admiring the problem. If we know where we need to go, and the route that we're taking to get there doesn't I'm just saying.
You're going to have a very fun year on this issue as the National Teacher of the Year. I think it is an important issue.
I'm just saying.
Figure it out.
And it's an issue, I think, at both the federal level and the states level. We're getting close on time, and so what I want to do is give each of you a chance kind of quickly to say, you know, if there's one policy that you think needs to be looked at the closest in states, really dealing with teacher pipeline issues, what would you recommend? I mean, is it around compensation or reciprocity? Is it around mentoring? Is it about perception issues with the profession itself?
I would like to start with the working conditions that teachers face when they are in the school. It seems to me that the research tells us over and over again that when people leave, that very frequently what they mention is pay, but also the conditions of working and how professionally rewarding it is, and the ability to work with colleagues and to be supported. So I would want to start there. And I think I want to conclude by saying, instead of viewing this as a current crisis to be dealt with in 10 minutes and then moved on, I think it's an opportunity to think about things like teacher pay and teacher working conditions and the connections between state policies and what we're asking of colleges of education.
I think we have a problem of perspective and narrative. You can't spend a decade mostly saying bad things about public education and then expect rational people to flock to it, right? You know, it may be the single most important public enterprise in the country. We used to think about it as how we grow and develop and nurture and support an economy. And our debate has been reduced to notions of markets and competition, and that, you know, the success in the classroom is strictly a function of an individual teacher, right? I think we've got to stop talking about teaching as if we were staffing factories, as if teachers were widgets. And if we could shift that perspective to one of professionalism and address the issues Shana raised about our sort of current orientation toward compliance and control, and start thinking in terms of professional responsibility and judgment, we would come to the question of how to grow and fill the pipeline very differently. That's what I would encourage us to do.
I think all of those things are very important. You know, it's a combination of everything that was mentioned in the slide, you know, compensation, working conditions, autonomy, creativity, you know, supportive administrators. But I think mentoring programs are very important. I think that we have to look at education very differently. When teachers come into schools, they need to feel supported. They need to be invested in the communities where they teach. It's very easy to walk away from a community that you don't care about. So if teachers are not seeing what's going on in their neighborhoods, learning the lives of their students, learning, you know, how does what happened here connect to the outside community, and then working together collaboratively. You know, so I think we just have to look at education very differently. You know, it's not just what happens inside the building, you know, and that's going to happen through partnerships and mentoring and bringing all of those people together.
This is a very important issue, and one we continue to hear from the states from often. And I think it's one that we're going to see a lot of states as there's changes in people in different positions of power, legislative chairs, chiefs, governors, that they're going to be grappling with for the next few years. And so please join me in thanking our panel for their insights and sharing.